Francis Fukuyama's Political Order and Political Decay from the Industrial Revolution to the Globalization of Democracy, 2014, is the second volume in his ambitious two-part project on political development. Following The Origins of Political Order, 2011, which traced the evolution of political institutions from pre-human times to the French Revolution, this second volume takes on the modern period, analyzing the development and decline of political systems from the 19th century to the present. Fukuyama attempts to answer a central question: why do some nations develop strong, stable, and effective political institutions, while others fall into corruption, stagnation, or collapse? At the heart of Fukuyama's argument are three core pillars of political order: the state, the rule of law, and accountability. For a political system to function well, these three institutions must evolve in a balanced and synergistic way. When one pillar grows at the expense of the others, or fails to develop at all, the system can veer toward decay, dysfunction, or authoritarianism. The state, building capacity. The first component, the state, is the central institution that exercises legitimate power over a territory. A strong state is not necessarily authoritarian, but one that can enforce laws, collect taxes, defend borders, provide infrastructure, and deliver services. Fukuyama draws heavily on Max Weber's definition of the modern state as a rational legal bureaucracy, highlighting how this type of state emerged first in 19th century Prussia and then spread across Europe and beyond. Fukuyama underscores that state building is a deeply political and often violent process. In many historical examples, war played a critical role in strengthening state capacity, forcing elites to create efficient bureaucracies and revenue systems. This contrasts with many post-colonial states in Africa and Asia, which achieved independence without enduring the same long-term internal pressures to build capable institutions. One of Fukuyama's major insights is that the sequence in which institutions develop matters significantly. A modern state emerging before democratization tends to produce a more effective government. For example, in Germany and Japan, authoritarian regimes constructed strong bureaucracies before transitioning to democracy. Conversely, in many developing countries, democratization occurred before the state had the capacity to enforce rules, leading to clientelism and weak governance. The rule of law. Constraints on power. The rule of law is the principle that the law is supreme and that all citizens, including leaders, are subject to it. In Fukuyama's framework, the rule of law is distinct from simply having laws. It requires a legal system that is independent, impartial, and broadly accepted by society. He traces the origins of rule of law traditions to religious and cultural developments, such as the canon law in medieval Europe and Confucian principles in East Asia. The rule of law plays a crucial role in limiting the arbitrary power of the state. However, Fukuyama shows that rule of law does not always evolve in step with state building. In the United States, for instance, legal traditions derived from British common law constrained the development of a centralized bureaucracy. This legacy contributed to what Fukuyama calls vetocracy, a political system in which too many actors can veto policy decisions, leading to gridlock. One of Fukuyama's important contributions is highlighting how informal norms and entrenched interests can inhibit the functioning of legal systems. Corruption flourishes when legal institutions are co-opted by elites, undermining both legitimacy and efficacy. For a democracy to survive and thrive, the rule of law must be strong enough to hold politicians accountable and protect the rights of citizens. Democratic checks. The third pillar, political accountability, refers to the ability of citizens to constrain and direct their leaders. This can take democratic forms, such as regular, free, and fair elections, or more informal or authoritarian variations, such as elite consensus or traditional authority. Fukuyama is not a democratist. He argues that democracy alone is not sufficient for good governance. Without effective state institutions and rule of law, democratic accountability can devolve into patronage and populism. He devotes considerable attention to the phenomenon of patrimonialism, a system where state resources are treated as private assets distributed by elites to their clients. This kind of corruption is particularly resistant to reform because it is deeply embedded in social and political networks. In many developing countries, Fukuyama notes, democratic institutions have been captured by patron-client relations, eroding state capacity and undermining legitimacy. An illustrative case is the United States, where Fukuyama argues that the political system has entered a phase of decay. Despite its long-standing institutions, America has become increasingly incapable of reform due to entrenched interest groups, over-reliance on legal mechanisms, and institutional fragmentation. Bureaucratic agencies are hamstrung by judicial review and legislative micromanagement, and the system of checks and balances has evolved into what he calls a vetocracy, where multiple veto points prevent effective governance. Political decay. Political decay, as Fukuyama defines it, occurs when institutions fail to adapt to new circumstances. This decay can take several forms: bureaucratic ossification, corruption, overcomplex legalism, or political polarization. Decay is not always sudden. Often it happens gradually, as once effective institutions become outdated or self-serving. Fukuyama uses the metaphor of repatrimonialization to describe how modern institutions can regress into forms of governance based on personal connections rather than legal norms or merit. He illustrates this point with historical and contemporary examples. In the Ottoman Empire, early bureaucratic innovations gave way to nepotism and stagnation. In contemporary times, the U.S. system shows symptoms of decay despite its democratic credentials. Civil service reforms from the progressive era have been diluted, and partisan gerrymandering and campaign financing have distorted the electoral system. Fukuyama also critiques the tendency of American courts to assume quasi-legislative roles, which further complicates governance and undermines accountability. In contrast, countries like China exhibit a different dynamic. Although not democratic, China has demonstrated a remarkable ability to build state capacity and implement long-term policy. Fukuyama does not endorse authoritarianism, but he acknowledges that China's meritocratic bureaucracy offers a counterpoint to liberal democracy's dysfunction. Nevertheless, he warns that without mechanisms of accountability and rule of law, even effective authoritarian regimes are vulnerable to abuse and instability. Reform and institutional innovation. Fukuyama emphasizes that successful political reform requires coalitions of reformers who can overcome entrenched interests. Change is often sparked by crises, wars, economic collapses, or social movements, but sustained reform depends on leadership and institutional design. He praises leaders like Theodore Roosevelt, who challenged the patronage system and built professional bureaucracies, and Lee Kuan Yew, who established a competent and corruption-resistant state in Singapore. The key to durable reform is autonomy and capacity. Bureaucracies must be insulated from politicization, yet accountable to democratic oversight. This balance is difficult to strike, especially in deeply divided societies. Furthermore, external factors, such as globalization, technological change, and migration, can place additional strains on political institutions requiring continual adaptation. Conclusion. In Political Order and Political Decay, Francis Fukuyama provides a sweeping and nuanced account of the development and erosion of political institutions in the modern world. He combines historical analysis, political theory, and contemporary case studies to illuminate the factors that enable states to govern effectively and democratically. His core thesis, that political development depends on a delicate balance between state capacity, rule of law, and accountability, is both compelling and sobering. The book serves as both diagnosis and warning. For countries struggling with weak institutions, Fukuyama offers a roadmap toward effective governance. For established democracies, he raises alarm bells about complacency and institutional atrophy. Political order is not a static achievement, but a dynamic process requiring vigilance, reform, and civic engagement. In a time of rising authoritarianism and democratic backsliding, Fukuyama's work remains profoundly relevant.